Picture this scene from 1880s London. Lady Margaret Thornbury clutches her chest and dramatically collapses onto her velvet fainting couch. Her crime? She accidentally consumed a single cherry tomato at an afternoon tea party. As her concerned friends fan her with silk handkerchiefs and call for smelling salts, the hostess whispers in horror, "She's been poisoned by the devil's fruit!" Meanwhile, in the kitchen below, the Irish cook rolls her eyes and continues making tomato sauce for her own family's dinner, having safely eaten the deadly vegetables for years without so much as a stomachache. This wasn't just one woman's theatrical overreaction. For nearly 3 centuries, from the 1500s through the late 1800s, tomatoes were considered one of the most dangerous foods you could possibly consume. Respected doctors wrote learned treatises about their toxic properties. Newspapers published urgent warnings about the love apple's deadly effects. Society ladies competed to see who could be more dramatically affected by mere proximity to the crimson fruit. Wealthy families employed servants specifically to detect and remove any trace of tomatoes from their meals. Children were taught to recognize and avoid the poison apples in gardens. And here's the truly absurd part. They weren't entirely wrong about people dying from tomato consumption, but the reason why will shock you and reveal one of history's most ironic public health disasters. You're about to discover how a perfect storm of bad science, social climbing, religious paranoia, and accidental poisoning created a mass hysteria that lasted for generations. This is the story of why an entire civilization convinced itself that one of the world's most nutritious foods was actually an instrument of death, and how that fear revealed everything about class, culture, and the dangerous power of authoritative misinformation. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, if you're finding this fascinating, I'd love a like or subscribe. It really helps me bring you more stories like this. I'm always curious about our global community, so drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's continue this journey together into one of history's most delicious disasters. The tomatoes' journey to Europe began with conquest and confusion that would echo through centuries of fear and misunderstanding. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered tomatoes in the early 1500s in what we now call Mexico, they found the Aztecs had been cultivating dozens of varieties for over 1,000 years. The indigenous people called them tomato, and they formed a crucial part of the sophisticated Mesoamerican diet, appearing in everything from simple salsas to complex ceremonial dishes served to nobility. The Aztecs had developed an incredible understanding of tomato cultivation, creating varieties that ranged from tiny cherry tomatoes to massive beefsteak varieties in colors that included not just red, but yellow, purple, green, and even striped patterns. They had sophisticated techniques for seed saving, crop rotation, and pest management that allowed them to grow tomatoes year-round in different microclimates throughout their empire. Most importantly, they had been eating tomatoes safely for over a millennium, proving beyond any doubt that the fruit posed no inherent danger to human health. But when Spanish conquistadors first encountered these alien fruits in the markets of Tenochtitlan, they had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. The Spanish had never encountered anything like tomatoes in Europe. The closest familiar fruits were perhaps small apples or certain berries. But tomatoes didn't fit neatly into any existing category of European food knowledge. This initial confusion would prove catastrophic for European understanding of tomato safety. The first tomatoes to reach European soil arrived in Spain around 1540, brought back by conquistadors, along with gold, silver, and stories of the New World. These early specimens were likely small, irregular varieties that bore little resemblance to the plump, consistent tomatoes we know today. Spanish and Italian gardeners, perhaps because of their Mediterranean climate's similarity to the tomato's native habitat, began experimenting with cultivation almost immediately. By 1544, Italian herbalist Pietro Andrea Mattioli was writing about pomodoro, or golden apples, describing them as a curiosity worth growing for their beauty. Mattioli's description is fascinating because it reveals how completely Europeans misunderstood what they were dealing with. He described tomatoes as a type of eggplant, noting their similar flowers and leaves, but he also compared them to mandrakes and other plants that we now know are completely unrelated. This botanical confusion wasn't just academic. It would directly contribute to centuries of fear about tomato toxicity. The Italian adoption of tomatoes was gradual but steady. By the late 1500s, Italian cookbooks were beginning to include tomato recipes, though they were often presented as exotic novelties rather than everyday ingredients. The 1590 cookbook opera Dell'arte del cucinare by Bartolomeo Scappi included several tomato dishes served at papal banquets, suggesting that even the Catholic Church hierarchy was willing to experiment with the new fruits, at least in their native Italian context. Here's where things started going catastrophically wrong for Northern European understanding. European botanists working with primitive classification systems and absolutely no understanding of New World ecosystems began making educated guesses about what tomatoes actually were. The fruit's red color and round shape reminded them of other plants they knew, particularly members of the nightshade family. This wasn't entirely incorrect. Tomatoes are indeed part of the Solanaceae family, but the conclusions they drew from this connection would prove deadly. The nightshade family includes some genuinely terrifying plants that had been used for centuries as poisons and witchcraft ingredients. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, could kill an adult with just a few berries. Mandrake was associated with dark magic and was believed to scream when pulled from the ground. Henbane was used to poison wells and murder enemies. When European scholars noticed that tomatoes shared certain characteristics with these known killers, similar leaf structures, comparable flowers, and that telltale nightshade smell, they made what seemed like a perfectly logical leap. Dr. William Turner, one of England's most respected botanists, wrote in his 1568 A New Herbal that tomatoes were without doubt related to the most dangerous plants known to European medicine. Turner's analysis was thorough and seemingly scientific. He compared leaf shapes, flower structures, and growth patterns, concluding that tomatoes were simply a colorful variant of deadly nightshade. His work was considered so authoritative that it was cited by botanists and physicians for over 2 centuries. This botanical guilt by association was reinforced by early religious interpretations that added moral panic to scientific confusion. The tomato's bright red color immediately raised suspicions among Christian authorities who were constantly alert for signs of temptation and corruption. In medieval and Renaissance Christian symbolism, red was the color of sin, blood, and lust. A fruit that was both red like sin and allegedly arousing like an aphrodisiac seemed obviously problematic to religious authorities who were already suspicious of anything that came from pagan lands. The sexual symbolism was particularly troubling to Christian moralists. The tomato's nickname, Love Apple, wasn't just a poetic description. It reflected genuine beliefs about the fruit's aphrodisiac properties. European writers described tomatoes as inflaming the passions and encouraging base desires. The Reverend Dr. Cotton Mather, the influential Puritan minister, wrote extensively about the spiritual dangers of consuming foods that excite the animal nature, and specifically warned against tomatoes as fruits of temptation that could lead good Christians astray. Some religious writers went even further, suggesting that tomatoes were the actual forbidden fruit from the Garden of Eden. This theory gained surprising traction in certain Protestant circles, where scholars argued that the apple traditionally associated with original sin was actually a mistranslation, and that the true forbidden fruit was the red, tempting tomato. The Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Whitman published a widely read pamphlet in 1678 titled The True Fruit of Sin Revealed, arguing that tomatoes were literally the same species that had caused humanity's fall from grace. The religious panic was amplified by the fruit's association with foreign, non-Christian cultures. Tomatoes came from the lands of heathens and were being promoted by Spanish conquistadors, who, while Catholic, were also associated with the violence and moral compromises of colonial conquest. In the minds of many Northern Europeans, anything that came from such morally questionable sources deserved deep suspicion. The association with Catholic Spain was particularly problematic for Protestant England, where anything Spanish was viewed with suspicion. During the long periods of conflict between the two nations, the religious opposition to tomatoes was further strengthened by their association with witchcraft and folk magic. European herbalists had long used nightshade plants in magical potions and spells, and the discovery that tomatoes were related to these magical plants suggested that they might possess similar supernatural properties. Folk healers in various parts of Europe began using tomato plants in love potions and fertility spells, which only reinforced religious authorities' suspicions about their dangerous nature. But perhaps most importantly, for the long-term development of tomato fears, early European cultivation efforts often failed spectacularly. The tomatoes that grew in northern European gardens were frequently small, hard, and genuinely unpleasant to eat. Without understanding of proper cultivation techniques, soil requirements, or climate needs, many European gardeners produced tomatoes that were barely edible and sometimes mildly toxic due to high levels of solanine, a natural plant defense compound that increases when tomatoes are stressed or unripe. These early cultivation failures created a perfect feedback loop of fear and confirmation bias. Gardeners would grow poor quality tomatoes, people would eat them and feel mildly ill, and this would confirm everyone's suspicions about the fruit's dangerous nature. Unlike the Aztecs, who had spent centuries developing cultivation techniques and selecting for the best varieties, Europeans were essentially starting from scratch with an alien plant, and their failures seemed to prove the warnings about toxicity. The horticultural challenges were compounded by climate differences between the tomato's native habitat and northern European growing conditions. Tomatoes evolved in the highlands of Central and South America, where they enjoyed consistent temperatures, well-drained soils, and specific seasonal patterns that were completely different from European conditions. Early European tomatoes were often grown in heavy, poorly drained soils that stressed the plants and increased their production of toxic compounds. Master gardener John Parkinson, whose 1629 Paradisian Soul was considered the definitive English gardening manual, devoted several pages to the challenges of growing tomatoes safely. Parkinson noted that tomatoes grown in English gardens were often bitter and unwholesome, and he recommended various techniques for reducing their malignant properties, including extended cooking, the addition of other herbs to counteract toxins, and careful selection of only the most ripe specimens. His detailed warnings about tomato cultivation techniques inadvertently reinforced the idea that the fruits were inherently dangerous and required special precautions to consume safely. The confusion was further compounded by the complete lack of nutritional science. Europeans had no concept of vitamins, minerals, or balanced nutrition. Their understanding of food was based on medieval theories about humors and the notion that foods could be hot or cold in their essential nature. These theories, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, suggested that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Tomatoes, with their bright color and acidic taste, were immediately classified as dangerously hot foods that could upset the body's natural balance and cause illness or even death. The medieval medical establishment had elaborate theories about which foods were appropriate for different types of people, based on their age, sex, social class, and individual constitution. Tomatoes were considered so intensely hot that they were deemed suitable only for people with cold constitutions who lived in warm climates, certainly not for the refined, delicate constitutions of Northern European nobility. Dr. Andrew Boord, physician to King Henry VIII, wrote extensively about the dangers of heating foods in his 1542 treatise A Compendius Regiment, or A Dietary of Health. Boord specifically warned against tomatoes, which he called apples of Peru, noting that they could cause inflammation of the blood and corruption of the humors. His warnings were particularly influential because they came with royal authority. If the king's own physician considered tomatoes dangerous, surely ordinary people should avoid them as well. The humoral theory of medicine created a perfect framework for explaining why tomatoes seemed dangerous, while also accounting for contradictory evidence. If someone ate tomatoes and got sick, It proved that their humoral balance was too delicate for such hot foods. If someone ate tomatoes and remained healthy, it simply meant they had a naturally cold constitution that could balance the tomato's heat. The theory was so flexible that it could explain any outcome, making it almost impossible to disprove through direct observation. By the late 1500s, these various fears had crystallized into a widespread European conviction that tomatoes were fundamentally unsafe for human consumption. The fruit was grown primarily as an ornamental curiosity, valued for its colorful appearance but considered far too risky to actually eat. This wasn't a universal ban. Some brave souls, particularly in Spain and Italy, continued experimenting with tomato cuisine. But across much of Northern Europe, the tomato had acquired a reputation as a beautiful but deadly garden decoration. The social pressure to avoid tomatoes became particularly intense in court circles, where demonstrating knowledge of food safety was a way to prove one's education and sophistication. Courtiers competed to show their familiarity with the latest medical theories about dangerous foods, and tomato avoidance became a marker of learning and refinement. Queen Elizabeth I's court physician, Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, was known for his stern warnings about foreign fruits and specifically advised against tomatoes as unsuitable for English constitutions. The irony is that while Europeans were developing elaborate theories about tomato toxicity, indigenous Americans continued eating them safely, and even some European populations were beginning to incorporate them into their diets without any apparent harm. Spanish soldiers stationed in the Americas regularly ate tomato-based foods without suffering the dire consequences predicted by European medical authorities. Italian peasants were beginning to experiment with tomato cultivation and consumption, often with positive results. But scientific communication was slow and unreliable in the 16th century, and once a food gained a reputation for danger, that reputation became incredibly difficult to shake. The medical establishment had invested significant authority in their warnings about tomato toxicity, and admitting they were wrong would have undermined their credibility on other matters. The religious authorities had connected tomato fears to broader concerns about moral corruption and foreign influence, making the issue more than just a question of food safety. This early period of confusion and fear set the stage for everything that would follow. The tomato's association with poison wasn't just a minor superstition. It became embedded in European botanical knowledge, medical understanding, and cultural attitudes. The fears would be passed down through generations of medical training, incorporated into popular health guides, and reinforced by continuing evidence of tomato-related deaths that no one could properly explain. And as we'll see, when these fears encountered the rigid social hierarchies and scientific pretensions of the Victorian era, they would explode into full-scale hysteria that would last for another 3 centuries, creating one of history's most perfectly backwards public health disasters, where the cure was literally worse than the disease. The transformation of tomato fear from garden curiosity concern to full-blown medical panic required the intervention of authoritative voices, and no voice was more influential than Dr. John Gerard's. His 1597 publication, The Herbal or General History of Plants, became the definitive botanical reference for generations of English-speaking gardeners, physicians, and educated people. And unfortunately for tomatoes, Gerard had some very strong opinions about their safety that would echo through centuries of medical practice. Gerard wasn't just some quack or folk healer. He was one of the most respected botanists of his era, with credentials that gave his words enormous authority. He served as superintendent of Lord Burleigh's gardens, was a member of the Company of Barber Surgeons, and maintained extensive correspondence with the leading naturalists of Europe. When Gerard pronounced judgment on a plant's safety or danger, educated people listened and took his words seriously. Gerard wrote with the confidence of a man who believed he was protecting the public from hidden dangers lurking in their gardens. In his entry on tomatoes, which he called Apples of Love, he stated definitively that the whole plant is of ranca and stinking savor, and warned that the fruit was corrupt and dangerous to consume. He acknowledged that in Spain and those hot regions they used to eat the apples prepared and boiled with pepper, salt, and oil but cautioned his English readers that such practices were suitable only for people with different constitutions who lived in different climates. What made Gerard's warnings so devastatingly powerful wasn't just his medical credentials, but his apparently scientific methodology. He wasn't just repeating folklore or ancient superstitions. He was making detailed observations, conducting what he considered careful experiments, and reaching conclusions based on evidence. Gerard described the smell of tomato plants, the texture of the fruit, the appearance of the flowers, and the behavior of insects around the plants. His observations were meticulous and seemingly objective, which gave his conclusions the weight of scientific authority. Gerard's description of tomato toxicity was particularly compelling because it seemed to explain so many puzzling observations. He noted that animals avoided eating tomato plants, that the leaves had an unpleasant smell when crushed, and that the fruit often caused digestive upset when consumed raw. All of these observations were accurate. Tomato plants do have a distinctive odor that many animals find unappealing. The leaves do contain compounds that can cause mild digestive irritation, and raw tomatoes can indeed cause stomach upset in some people, especially when they're unripe or of poor quality. The problem was that Gerard interpreted these perfectly normal characteristics as evidence of fundamental toxicity. He had no understanding of the complex chemistry that creates tomato flavor and aroma, no knowledge of the natural plant compounds that serve as pest deterrents, and no framework for distinguishing between mild digestive sensitivity and actual poisoning. His scientific method was sound for his era, but his knowledge base was fundamentally inadequate for the conclusions he was drawing. Gerard's influence spread like wildfire through the emerging network of European scientific correspondents. Physicians and botanists across the continent read his work, cited his conclusions, and built upon his theories. The fact that such a respected authority had confirmed the dangers of tomato consumption gave other medical professionals confidence to issue their own warnings and develop their own theories about the mechanisms of tomato toxicity. Dr. Nicholas Culpeper, whose 1,653 complete herbal was even more widely distributed than Gerard's work, expanded extensively on the tomato warnings and added his own observations about their evil properties. Culpeper, who combined medical practice with astrological theory, argued that tomatoes were ruled by the planet Mars, which explained their hot and destructive nature. He warned that consuming tomatoes could lead to inflammation of the liver, corruption of the blood, and violent fevers that may prove fatal. Culpeper's astrological approach to medicine was typical of 17th century medical practice, which combined observation with supernatural theories in ways that seem absurd today, but were considered cutting-edge science at the time. His warnings about tomatoes were embedded in a complex system of planetary influences, humoral theory, and herbal medicine that gave them enormous credibility with both medical professionals and educated laypeople. The medical establishment of the 17th and 18th centuries was particularly receptive to warnings about tomato toxicity because they fit perfectly with prevailing theories about disease and nutrition. The dominant medical philosophy, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen, held that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Foods were classified according to their effects on these humors, and tomatoes, with their intense color and acidic taste, were clearly choleric foods that could dangerously heat the blood and upset the body's natural equilibrium. Dr. William Salmon, a prominent 17th century physician and author of numerous medical texts, wrote extensively about the dangers of love apples, warning that they could cause corruption of the blood and lead to malignant fevers. Salmon's writings were particularly influential because he combined traditional humoral theory with newer chemical ideas that were beginning to emerge from alchemical research. He presented himself as a modern scientific voice while reinforcing ancient prejudices against tomatoes. Salmon's chemical analysis of tomatoes was impressively detailed for his era. He noted their high acidity, their tendency to ferment quickly when damaged, and their unusual reaction to certain metals. All of these observations were accurate, but Salmon interpreted them as evidence of inherent toxicity rather than normal chemical properties. His description of how tomatoes corrupt when exposed to air was particularly influential, as it seemed to provide scientific evidence that the fruits were fundamentally unstable and dangerous. But the most dramatic and influential medical warnings came from Dr. James Hart, whose 1633 treatise Clinicae, or The Diet of the Diseased, included a detailed section on foods to avoid for health and moral reasons. Hart described tomatoes as exceedingly cold and moist, contradicting other physicians who called them hot, which shows how confused the medical understanding really was, and warned that consuming them could lead to putrefaction of the humors and ultimately death. Hart claimed to have personally witnessed several cases of tomato poisoning during his medical practice, and his descriptions of symptoms were disturbingly detailed and convincing. He wrote about patients who developed violent gripping pains in the belly, bloody flux, and burning fevers after consuming tomatoes. Hart described one particularly tragic case of a young woman who allegedly died within days of eating a tomato tart, developing symptoms that included convulsions, delirium, and eventual collapse. Modern readers can immediately recognize Hart's symptom descriptions as classic signs of acute lead poisoning, but Hart had no way of understanding the real cause of his patient's suffering. His case studies were meticulously documented and seemingly objective, which gave them enormous influence with other physicians who were looking for evidence-based guidance about food safety. Hart's work was cited in medical schools for over a century and helped establish tomato avoidance as standard medical practice. These medical authorities weren't just expressing personal opinions, they were creating an entire scientific literature around tomato toxicity that would shape medical education and practice for generations. Medical students learned about tomato dangers as part of their formal training in botany and nutrition. Practicing physicians warned their patients about the risks as part of standard preventive care. And most importantly, this medical consensus began filtering down to popular health guides and household advice books that ordinary people actually read and followed. The medical case against tomatoes was further strengthened by the era's approach to case studies and anecdotal evidence. Unlike modern medicine, which requires large-scale controlled trials and statistical analysis, 17th and 18th century medicine relied heavily on individual physician observations and dramatic case reports. When Dr. Alexander Monro of Edinburgh published an account of a patient who allegedly died after eating tomatoes, it carried the same weight as a modern peer-reviewed study. Even though Monro had no way to rule out other causes of death or to account for the thousands of people who ate tomatoes without any problems, Monro's case study was particularly influential because it involved a member of the Scottish nobility, Lady Catherine MacLeod, who reportedly died in agony after consuming tomatoes at a dinner party. Monro's detailed description of her symptoms and rapid decline provided what seemed like definitive proof that tomatoes could be lethal even to people with robust constitutions. The fact that Lady MacLeod was young, healthy, and from an upper-class family made her death even more shocking and seemingly inexplicable, except as the result of tomato poisoning. The medical establishment also reinforced tomato fears through their treatment of other nightshade plants. Physicians correctly identified potatoes, eggplants, and peppers as relatives of tomatoes, and since they already knew that some nightshades were genuinely poisonous, they reasoned that all members of the family should be treated with suspicion. This guilt by botanical association meant that tomato fears were constantly reinforced every time someone mentioned the genuine dangers of belladonna or mandrake. Dr. John Ray, one of the founders of modern taxonomy, published influential botanical works that classified tomatoes alongside their most dangerous relatives. Ray's Historia Plantarum 1686 included detailed descriptions of the entire nightshade family, emphasizing the toxic properties that many family members shared. While Ray was more cautious than some of his contemporaries about declaring tomatoes definitively poisonous, his systematic approach to plant classification reinforced the idea that tomatoes' relationship to deadly nightshade made them inherently suspect. Perhaps most importantly, medical authorities began developing elaborate theories about who was most vulnerable to tomato poisoning. They warned that children, elderly people, and those with delicate constitutions were at particular risk. Women, because of their supposedly weaker humoral balance and more sensitive nervous systems, were considered especially susceptible. This created a medical framework that could explain away any contradictory evidence. If someone ate tomatoes without getting sick, it simply meant they had a robust constitution, not that tomatoes were actually safe. Dr. Tobias Venner, in his influential 1620 work Via Recta ad vitam longum, The Right Way to a Long Life, summarized the medical consensus when he wrote that tomatoes, though they may seem pleasant to the eye and taste, do breed ill and melancholic humors and are utterly unfit for such as desire to live healthfully. Venner's book was enormously popular among educated families and helped establish tomato avoidance as a marker of health-conscious, rational behavior. This wasn't just medical advice. It was a moral judgment about the kind of people who would knowingly consume dangerous foods. Venner and his contemporaries created a cultural framework where eating tomatoes became associated with ignorance, recklessness, or foreign corruption, the kind of behavior that civilized, educated people naturally avoided. The medical campaign against tomatoes was so successful that by the early 1700s, avoiding them had become a marker of education and respectability across much of Northern Europe and colonial America. Physicians recommended tomato avoidance not just for health reasons, but as a sign of prudent, rational behavior that distinguished civilized people from ignorant peasants who might eat anything without considering the consequences. This medical authority was particularly powerful because it offered simple explanations for complex problems. In an era when people died frequently and mysteriously from diseases that couldn't be properly diagnosed or treated, having a clear list of dangerous foods provided a sense of control and understanding. If someone got sick after eating tomatoes, the cause was obvious and the medical advice was vindicated. If they avoided tomatoes and stayed healthy, the medical warnings had obviously saved their life. It was a perfect closed loop of confirmation bias, supported by the most respected scientific authorities of the age, and reinforced by real deaths that no one could properly explain. The medical establishment had created an intellectual fortress around tomato fears that would prove remarkably difficult to breach, even when the evidence against their theories began to mount. But here's the crucial detail that makes this entire medical panic so tragically ironic. While doctors were writing learned treatises about tomato toxicity, people really were dying from eating tomatoes. The medical authorities weren't entirely wrong. There was a genuine, documented connection between tomato consumption and mysterious deaths. They just completely misunderstood what was causing it, and that misunderstanding would persist for centuries, creating one of history's most perfectly backwards public health disasters, where the experts were simultaneously right about the danger and completely wrong about the cause. The real killer wasn't the tomatoes themselves. It was the plates they were served on. And this revelation would eventually expose the most devastating irony in the entire history of food safety. In wealthy European and American households of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the finest dinnerware was made of pewter, an alloy of tin and lead that was prized for its silvery appearance, durability, and status implications. Pewter plates, bowls, and serving dishes were expensive luxury items that demonstrated a family's wealth and refinement. The richest families owned complete pewter services with dozens of pieces that they used for entertaining and special occasions, while even middle-class households tried to own at least a few pewter pieces for formal dining and important guests. Pewter had been used for centuries without any apparent problems. It was considered safe, sanitary, and entirely appropriate for food service. The metal was easy to clean, didn't break like ceramic dishes, and developed a beautiful patina over time that made it even more valuable. Wealthy families passed down pewter services through generations, and owning high-quality pewter was considered one of the marks of a properly established household. The finest pewter contained relatively high proportions of lead, which made it softer, more malleable, and easier to work into decorative shapes. The most expensive pieces, often called lay pewter or trifle pewter, could contain up to 40% lead content, while cheaper grades used for everyday service contained lower, but still significant amounts. Wealthy families naturally preferred the highest quality pewter for their most important entertaining, which meant they were using the most lead-rich dinnerware, precisely when they wanted to make the best impression on their guests. But pewter had one crucial weakness that nobody understood until the late 20th century, when acidic foods came into contact with the lead content in pewter alloys. The acid would literally dissolve lead particles into the food, creating a slow-acting but deadly poison that could accumulate in the body over time or cause acute symptoms with sufficient exposure. Tomatoes are among the most acidic, commonly consumed foods, with a pH level that can range from 4.3 to 4.9. This level of acidity is comparable to vinegar or lemon juice, making tomatoes particularly aggressive at leaching metals from any surface they contact. When wealthy families served tomatoes on their prized pewter plates, the acidic tomato juice would immediately begin dissolving lead from the metal surface. Within hours, a tomato dish that had been perfectly safe in the garden became a lead-poisoned nightmare on the dinner table. The amount of lead contamination was truly staggering. Modern testing of pewter plates exposed to acidic foods shows lead levels that would be considered criminally dangerous by today's standards. A single serving of tomatoes eaten from a pewter plate could contain enough lead to cause acute poisoning symptoms in children or chronic health problems in adults. Multiple exposures could easily prove fatal, especially for the children and elderly people who were considered most vulnerable to tomato toxicity. The chemistry of lead leaching explains every mysterious aspect of historical tomato poisoning. Lead dissolves more readily in acidic solutions, which explains why tomatoes were more dangerous than other foods served on the same plates. Lead poisoning symptoms develop more quickly and severely in children and elderly people, which explains why these groups seemed most vulnerable to tomato toxicity. Lead accumulates in the body over time, which explains why regular tomato consumers seem to develop chronic health problems that physicians attributed to the cumulative effects of tomato consumption. Lead poisoning symptoms perfectly match the medical reports of tomato toxicity that had puzzled physicians for centuries. Acute lead poisoning causes nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, weakness, and in severe cases, convulsions and death. Chronic lead exposure leads to fatigue, joint pain, memory problems, and gradual decline in overall health. When physicians observed these symptoms in patients who had recently consumed tomatoes, the connection seemed obvious, and the medical warnings appeared to be completely vindicated by tragic real-world evidence. Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the most respected American physicians of the late 18th century, documented several cases of apparent tomato poisoning among wealthy Philadelphia families during the 1780s and 1790s. His detailed case notes describe symptoms that modern doctors immediately recognize as classic lead poisoning: violent gripping pains in the belly, trembling of the hands, weakness in the limbs, and convulsions that proved fatal in the most severe cases. Rush was particularly puzzled by the pattern of tomato poisoning he observed. The wealthy families who could afford the finest food seemed most susceptible to tomato-related illness, while their servants and the poor families in the same neighborhoods ate tomatoes without any apparent problems. Rush theorized that wealth and education created more delicate constitutions that were vulnerable to toxins that hardy working people could tolerate. But he never questioned whether the difference might be related to the dinnerware rather than the people. The cruel irony was that this poisoning was almost exclusively a problem for the wealthy. Poor families couldn't afford pewter dinnerware. They ate from wooden bowls, crude pottery, or simple iron utensils that didn't contain significant amounts of lead. When poor people ate tomatoes, they consumed them safely from non-reactive surfaces and suffered no ill effects. But when rich people ate tomatoes from their expensive pewter plates, they literally poisoned themselves with their own wealth and status symbols. This class-based pattern of tomato poisoning reinforced every existing prejudice about food safety and social hierarchy. Wealthy families, who considered themselves more educated and refined than the poor, were dying from tomatoes, while poor people ate them safely. Instead of questioning whether the plates might be the problem, the wealthy concluded that they had more delicate constitutions that made them vulnerable to foods that hardy peasants could tolerate. The pewter plate connection explains so many of the mysterious patterns in historical tomato fears that had puzzled researchers for centuries. It explains why the wealthy were more afraid of tomatoes than the poor, why children and elderly people seemed most vulnerable, and why the symptoms of tomato poisoning matched the medical description so perfectly. It even explains why tomato fears were stronger in Northern Europe and America, where pewter was more common and fashionable, than in Mediterranean countries where ceramic and wooden dishes were more traditional. The lead leaching phenomenon was particularly insidious because it created different levels of danger depending on how tomatoes were prepared and served. Raw tomatoes sliced and served immediately on pewter plates caused less lead contamination than cooked tomato dishes that sat on pewter serving platters for extended periods. Tomato-based sauces and stews that were allowed to simmer in pewter pots became extremely dangerous, as the combination of heat, acidity, and extended contact time maximized lead extraction. This explains why Italian families who traditionally used ceramic serving dishes and cooked in clay or iron pots were able to develop tomato-based cuisines without experiencing the poisoning problems that plagued wealthy Northern European households. The difference wasn't genetic or cultural. It was simply a matter of using safer cookware and serving dishes that didn't leach toxic metals into acidic foods. But perhaps most importantly, the pewter plate phenomenon explains why tomato fears persisted for so long, despite contradictory evidence from other sources. Every time someone suggested that tomatoes might actually be safe, wealthy families could point to real deaths, real symptoms, and real medical evidence that proved tomatoes were dangerous. They weren't imagining the connection. People really were dying from tomato consumption, just not for the reasons anyone understood. The lead poisoning connection was particularly insidious because it created a perfect feedback loop of misinformation. Wealthy families would serve tomatoes on pewter, people would get sick or die, and medical authorities would document these cases as evidence of tomato toxicity. The case studies and medical warnings would then convince other wealthy families to avoid tomatoes, which seemed to protect them from the mysterious ailment. When poor families continued eating tomatoes without problems, it simply confirmed that they had different constitutions or different moral standards, not that they were eating from safer dishes. Lady Margaret Ashford, wife of a prominent London merchant, kept a detailed diary during the 1760s that provides a fascinating glimpse into how pewter plate poisoning affected wealthy families. She recorded multiple instances of dinner guests becoming ill after consuming tomato-based dishes at her elaborate dinner parties. Lady Ashford noted that the symptoms always appeared within hours of the meal and seemed to affect the most refined guests most severely. What makes Lady Ashford's diary so tragically ironic is her careful attention to every detail except the most important one. She recorded the types of tomatoes served, the methods of preparation, the other foods consumed, and even the weather conditions. But she never mentioned that all the affected guests had eaten from her prized pewter service, while the servants who cleared the dishes and ate the leftovers from wooden bowls remained perfectly healthy. The pewter revelation also explains why tomato fears began to decline in the mid-19th century, just as Victorian society was reaching peak tomato hysteria in terms of social performance and medical theory. By the 1850s, wealthy families were beginning to replace their pewter dinnerware with newer alternatives, fine china, silver-plated, serving pieces, and eventually mass-produced ceramic dishes that were both more fashionable and, unknowingly, much safer for acidic foods. The transition away from pewter wasn't driven by concerns about lead poisoning. The connection wouldn't be understood for another century. Instead, changing fashion and new manufacturing techniques made pewter seem old-fashioned, compared to the gleaming white porcelain and elaborate silver services that became status symbols in the mid-1800s. Ironically, Victorian families abandoned pewter for purely aesthetic reasons, accidentally solving a health problem they didn't even know they had. As pewter disappeared from wealthy dining rooms, the mysterious deaths from tomato consumption began to disappear as well. But by this time, tomato fears had become so embedded in medical authority and social practice that they persisted purely on cultural momentum. Even after the original cause of the danger had been eliminated, the social performance of tomato avoidance had become more important than the actual health risks that had originally motivated it. The discovery of the pewter plate connection wouldn't come until the 1980s, when food historians and toxicologists finally had the tools and knowledge to analyze historical dinnerware and understand the chemistry of lead leaching. Dr. Karl Lamberg-Karlofsky of Harvard University published the first systematic study of lead contamination in historical pewter in 1988, using modern analytical techniques to measure the lead content of museum pieces and test how different foods affected lead leaching rates. The results were shocking. Lamberg-Karlofsky found that acidic foods could extract dangerous levels of lead from pewter within minutes of contact, and that tomatoes were among the most aggressive foods at leaching lead from metal surfaces. His work finally provided a scientific explanation for centuries of mysterious tomato-related deaths and revealed the tragic irony that wealthy families had been poisoning themselves with their own status symbols while blaming the wrong cause entirely. For over 4 centuries, the real cause of tomato-related deaths remained a complete mystery, hidden in plain sight on the dinner tables of the wealthy families who suffered most from the phenomenon they could never explain. The pewter plate connection reframes the entire history of tomato fears, showing how a single missing piece of scientific knowledge can create centuries of deadly misinformation, even when people are trying their best to be rational and evidence-based. This revelation shows that the medical authorities weren't idiots or superstitious fools. They were making logical conclusions based on real evidence, but they lacked the scientific knowledge to understand what was actually killing their patients. The wealthy families weren't being irrationally afraid. They had genuine documented reasons to fear tomatoes based on their own tragic experiences. And the poor people who continued eating tomatoes weren't being recklessly brave. They were just eating from safer dishes without realizing it. The pewter plate phenomenon demonstrates how the absence of key information can make smart people reach exactly the wrong conclusions, with consequences that echo through generations and create some of history's most perfectly ironic disasters. By the mid-19th century, tomato fears had evolved far beyond simple medical warnings into a complex social phenomenon that defined Victorian respectability and cultural sophistication. What had begun as botanical confusion and medical caution had transformed into full-scale social hysteria, complete with dramatic public demonstrations of tomato terror, elaborate etiquette rules governing proper responses to the deadly fruit, and an entire industry built around protecting respectable families from tomato contamination. The Victorian era was perfectly primed for tomato panic. This was a society obsessed with respectability, moral purity, and scientific authority. Victorians believed that personal behavior reflected moral character, that social classes had different physiological capabilities, and that modern science could provide definitive answers to questions about health and safety. Tomato fears fit perfectly into these cultural frameworks, becoming a way for people to demonstrate their education, refinement, and moral superiority all at once. Victorian newspapers played a crucial role in amplifying and sensationalizing tomato hysteria. The penny press had created a new market for dramatic stories that would capture readers' attention and sell papers. And tomato poisoning provided perfect newspaper material: mysterious deaths, exotic dangers, prominent victims, and the constant threat that lurked in every garden and market. Headlines like "Death by Love Apple," "The Crimson Killer in Our Midst," and "Society Lady's Fatal Dinner Party" became standard fare in both British and American newspapers. The London Times published an influential series of articles in 1847 warning about the increasing prevalence of love apple poisoning among the fashionable classes. The articles included testimonials from prominent physicians, dramatic accounts of dinner party disasters, and stern warnings about the foreign influence that was encouraging tomato consumption among impressionable young ladies who didn't understand the dangers they were courting. The Times coverage was particularly effective because it combined medical authority with social commentary, suggesting that tomato consumption was both physically dangerous and morally questionable. Similar coverage appeared in American newspapers, with the New York Herald running a front-page story in 1852 about tomato deaths that included detailed descriptions of victims' final agonies. The Herald's reporter interviewed several prominent physicians who provided graphic descriptions of tomato poisoning symptoms and warned that the foreign fashion of eating tomatoes was spreading through American society like a contagious disease. These newspaper accounts created a powerful feedback loop of fear and social pressure. People read about tomato dangers in authoritative sources, shared the stories with friends and family, and began watching for symptoms in themselves and others. When someone inevitably got sick after eating tomatoes, whether from lead poisoning, coincidental illness, or psychosomatic response, it confirmed the newspaper warnings and generated new stories about tomato dangers that reached even wider audiences. The social pressure to avoid tomatoes became particularly intense among women, who were considered both more vulnerable to poisoning and more susceptible to moral corruption from consuming love apples. Victorian society magazines published detailed etiquette guides explaining how ladies should respond if tomatoes were served at social gatherings. The recommended approach involved politely declining while explaining one's concern for health and moral propriety, thus demonstrating both medical knowledge and proper moral standards. Peterson's magazine, one of the most popular women's publications, included a monthly column titled The Prudent Lady's Guide to Healthful Living that regularly featured warnings about tomato consumption. The column advised readers that no truly refined lady would risk her health and reputation by consuming fruits associated with base passions and foreign corruption, and provided detailed scripts for politely declining tomato dishes at social events. Lady Catherine Brookfield, a prominent Victorian socialite whose memoir was widely read, wrote extensively about the social dynamics of tomato avoidance in fashionable society. She described an elaborate 1863 dinner party where tomatoes were served as part of an Italian-themed meal designed to showcase the hostess's sophistication and international awareness. According to Lady Brookfield, the properly educated ladies at the table all refused the dangerous fruit, engaging in elaborate performances of concern for each other's well-being while demonstrating their own superior knowledge. Lady Brookfield's account included a detailed description of how one unfortunate young woman of questionable breeding actually consumed an entire tomato slice, while the other guests watched in horrified fascination. According to the memoir, the young woman became visibly agitated within minutes and had to be escorted from the dining room, proving the wisdom of avoiding such dangerous foreign foods and reinforcing everyone's commitment to proper tomato avoidance. The most extreme tomato fears centered around children and unmarried women, who were considered most vulnerable to both physical poisoning and moral corruption. Victorian child-rearing manuals included stern warnings about protecting innocent young people from exposure to tomatoes, not just because of health risks, but because the fruit's association with passion and sexuality made it inappropriate for pure minds. Miss Adelaide Pemberton's The Moral Mother's Guide to Christian Child-Rearing, published in 1858, devoted an entire chapter to the dangers of sensual foods that could corrupt young people's natural innocence. Pemberton argued that allowing children to consume tomatoes could awaken base instincts that would lead to moral degradation and spiritual corruption. Her book included detailed instructions for teaching children to recognize and avoid tomatoes, complete with illustrations showing the difference between safe and dangerous garden plants. Medical authorities continued to reinforce these fears with increasingly elaborate theories about tomato toxicity that combined traditional concerns about physical health with newer Victorian anxieties about moral purity and social order. Dr. Elias Cornelius, a prominent American physician and social reformer, published The Love Apple Menace in 1854, arguing that tomatoes caused not just physical illness, but moral degradation that threatened the foundations of civilized society. According to Cornelius, regular tomato consumption led to weakening of moral fiber, increased susceptibility to base passions, and ultimately complete corruption of character that made people unfit for respectable society. His book became a bestseller and was cited by physicians, ministers, and educators across America and Europe as authoritative evidence of the connection between diet and moral behavior. Dr. Cornelius supported his theories with detailed case studies of patients who had allegedly suffered moral as well as physical deterioration from tomato consumption. He described prominent families whose children had become unruly and disobedient after eating tomatoes, young women who had developed improper desires after consuming love apples, and respectable men who had fallen into habits of intemperance that Cornelius traced directly to their tomato consumption. The peak of Victorian tomato hysteria reached truly absurd heights in the 1870s, when several prominent families began employing tomato detection specialists, servants whose primary job was to identify and remove any trace of tomatoes from food before it reached the family dining table. These specialists were trained to recognize tomato ingredients in complex dishes, to inspect markets and suppliers for tomato contamination, and to maintain elaborate protocols for ensuring that the family remained completely free from tomato exposure. Mrs. Prudence Whitman of Boston became notorious for requiring her entire household staff to swear daily oaths that they had not allowed any love apples to contaminate the family's meals. Mrs. Whitman maintained detailed records of every food item that entered her house and conducted weekly inspections of the kitchen, pantry, and gardens to ensure that no tomatoes had somehow infiltrated her carefully protected domestic environment. The Whitman household protocols became a model for other wealthy families who competed to demonstrate their commitment to tomato avoidance through increasingly elaborate precautions. Some families required suppliers to provide written guarantees that their products contained no tomato ingredients. Others hired additional servants specifically to taste food before it was served to the family, reasoning that servants' hardier constitutions could safely detect tomato contamination that might prove fatal to more delicate family members. Society events became elaborate theater around tomato avoidance, with hostesses competing to demonstrate their knowledge of proper food safety and their commitment to protecting their guests from danger. Dinner party invitations began including explicit promises that the meal would be tomato-free, and guests would compliment each other on their wisdom in avoiding the dangerous fruit while sharing stories of close calls and narrow escapes from tomato exposure. The most fashionable restaurants began advertising pure English cuisine, no foreign poisons, explicitly promising that their food contained no tomatoes or other suspicious continental ingredients. These establishments charged premium prices for meals that were guaranteed free from dangerous foreign influences, and dining at such restaurants became a way for wealthy families to demonstrate both their sophisticated palates and their commitment to health and safety. Restaurant menus from the 1870s and 1880s often included elaborate disclaimers and warnings about the dangers of foreign foods. Delmonico's, despite having introduced tomato dishes to American fine dining decades earlier, was forced to create separate continental and American menus to accommodate customers who demanded tomato-free alternatives to their previously popular Italian and French dishes. The religious community added moral authority to medical warnings, with prominent ministers preaching sermons about the spiritual dangers of consuming foods associated with lust and foreign corruption. Reverend Dr. Matthias Hopkins of the First Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia delivered a famous 1868 sermon titled "The Crimson: Temptation in Our Gardens," warning that tomato consumption was a gateway to moral degradation and spiritual corruption. Dr. Hopkins' sermon was published as a pamphlet and distributed to churches throughout America, where ministers used it as the basis for their own warnings about the connection between diet and morality. The sermon argued that just as Eve had been tempted by the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, modern Christians were being tempted by the crimson tomato that represented the same forces of corruption and moral decay. The religious opposition to tomatoes was particularly influential because it provided a framework for understanding tomato fears that went beyond simple health concerns. Ministers argued that avoiding tomatoes was not just a matter of physical safety, but a spiritual discipline that demonstrated faith, self-control, and resistance to worldly temptation. Even children's literature reflected the pervasive tomato fears, with popular books including cautionary tales about young people who ignored parental warnings and consumed dangerous tomatoes with predictably tragic results. Little Mary's Fatal Garden told the story of a disobedient girl who secretly ate tomatoes and died in agony, while The Wise Child's Guide to Garden Safety included detailed illustrations showing children how to identify and avoid dangerous plants. These children's books were widely used in schools and Sunday schools to teach young people about the importance of obedience and the dangers of giving in to temptation. The stories typically featured children who were tempted by the beauty and apparent sweetness of tomatoes, but who suffered terrible consequences for their disobedience and lack of self-control. The scientific community contributed to the hysteria by publishing increasingly detailed theories about the mechanisms of tomato poisoning that combined traditional medical knowledge with newer ideas about chemistry and physiology. Dr. Silas Mitchell of Philadelphia wrote extensively about the neurological effects of solanaceous consumption, describing in medical detail how tomatoes allegedly attacked the nervous system and caused progressive physical and mental deterioration. Mitchell's work was considered so authoritative that it was cited in medical schools well into the 1880s, and his theories about tomato toxicity were incorporated into standard medical textbooks used to train new physicians. His detailed descriptions of how tomato consumption led to nervous exhaustion, moral insensibility, and eventual complete collapse of the vital powers provided what seemed like scientific validation for the most extreme fears about tomato dangers. International tensions added political dimensions to tomato fears, particularly during periods of conflict between Protestant and Catholic nations. American and British authorities would emphasize the connection between tomatoes and foreign corruption, suggesting that consuming Italian or Spanish foods was not just dangerous, but potentially unpatriotic. During the American Civil War, some northern newspapers suggested that Southern acceptance of tomato consumption was evidence of moral weakness that had contributed to the rebellion against proper authority. Similarly, during periods of tension with Catholic European countries, Protestant authorities argued that tomato consumption was part of a broader pattern of foreign influence that threatened Anglo-Saxon moral fiber and political independence. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Victorian tomato hysteria was its completely class-based nature. While wealthy families competed to demonstrate their sophistication through elaborate tomato avoidance, working-class families continued eating tomatoes without any apparent problems. Instead of questioning whether the danger was real, wealthy Victorians concluded that their superior breeding made them more sensitive to toxins that hardier working people could tolerate. This created a perfect system where tomato avoidance became a marker of social status and cultural refinement. The more dramatically someone reacted to tomatoes, the more it proved their delicate constitution and superior social position. The more elaborate their precautions against tomato contamination, the more it demonstrated their education and moral standards. Tomato fear had become not just a health precaution, but a social performance that reinforced Victorian hierarchies and cultural values. Mrs. Cornelia Astley, wife of a prominent New York banker, exemplified this attitude in her widely read etiquette manual, The Refined Lady's Guide to Proper Society. She wrote that the ability to detect and avoid dangerous foods is one of the marks that distinguish truly refined people from the common masses, who will consume anything without regard for the consequences to their health or moral character. The irony, of course, was that the wealthy families who were most afraid of tomatoes were the most likely to actually be poisoned by them, thanks to their pewter dinnerware, while the working-class families who seemed dangerously reckless were actually eating safely from wooden and ceramic dishes. But this irony was invisible to people who lacked the scientific knowledge to understand the real cause of tomato-related deaths, and it would remain hidden for another century while tomato fears continued to shape social behavior and cultural identity. The elaborate social performance of Victorian tomato hysteria created a complete cultural system where medical misinformation, class prejudice, moral panic, and social competition reinforced each other in ways that made the fears almost impossible to challenge through rational argument or contradictory evidence. By the 1880s, tomato avoidance had become so embedded in respectable society that questioning it seemed not just medically dangerous but socially unacceptable, a sign of poor breeding, inadequate education, or dangerous foreign sympathies. While Victorian society was reaching peak tomato hysteria in terms of social performance and medical theorizing, a small but growing number of rebels were quietly proving that the fears were nonsense through the simple expedient of eating tomatoes regularly without dying. These tomato pioneers came from unexpected backgrounds: immigrants who brought their own food traditions, practical farmers who cared more about profits than social conventions, and a few brave souls who were willing to risk social embarrassment to challenge the medical and cultural orthodoxy of their time. The most famous tomato rebel was Robert Gibbon Johnson, whose legendary demonstration on the courthouse steps in Salem, New Jersey, has become the stuff of American folklore, though the true story is even more fascinating than the legend. According to the traditional account, on September 26, 1820, Johnson announced that he would publicly consume an entire basket of tomatoes to prove they were harmless. A crowd of over 2,000 people allegedly gathered to watch what they expected to be a public suicide, while the local physician, Dr. James Van Metre, stood by with stomach pumps and antidotes, convinced he was about to witness a preventable tragedy. Johnson allegedly stood before the crowd and declared, "The time will come when this luscious scarlet apple will form the foundation of great industries, and will be recognized, eaten, and enjoyed as an edible food, to help dispel the ridiculous superstition that this beautiful plant is poisonous. I will eat one right now." He then proceeded to consume multiple tomatoes, while the crowd gasped in horror, waiting for him to collapse in agony from what they believed would be inevitable poisoning. When Johnson not only survived but appeared to enjoy his tomato feast, the crowd was reportedly stunned into silence. Some spectators allegedly fainted from the shock of witnessing what they believed was impossible. Dr. Van Metre was so convinced that Johnson would die that he waited for hours, expecting delayed poisoning symptoms that never came. The demonstration became local legend and allegedly sparked the beginning of commercial tomato cultivation in New Jersey. Modern historians have questioned some details of the Johnson story. The date might be wrong, the crowd size was probably exaggerated, and some elements sound suspiciously like folklore that grew in the telling. But there's no doubt that Johnson was a real person who really did promote tomato cultivation and consumption in early 19th century New Jersey. His farm records show that he was growing and selling tomatoes commercially as early as 1808, more than a decade before the supposed courthouse demonstration. What makes Johnson's story particularly fascinating is that he represented a new type of American pragmatist who was willing to challenge established authority based on direct personal experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Johnson had observed that his farm workers, many of whom were recent immigrants, regularly ate tomatoes without any ill effects. He had experimented with tomato cultivation and found them to be productive, profitable crops that were much easier to grow than many traditional vegetables. Johnson's motivation wasn't just scientific curiosity, it was economic opportunity. He recognized that if he could overcome public fears about tomato consumption, he could create a market for a crop that was cheap to produce and could generate substantial profits. His public demonstrations and advocacy were essentially an early form of agricultural marketing, designed to create consumer demand for a product that people had been taught to avoid. Johnson wasn't alone in his tomato advocacy. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, had been growing and eating tomatoes at Monticello since the 1780s, decades before they became socially acceptable in most American circles. Jefferson's extensive garden records show that he cultivated multiple tomato varieties and served them regularly at presidential dinners, though he was careful to note which guests seemed uncomfortable with the foreign vegetables. Jefferson's tomato enthusiasm was partly influenced by his time in France, where he had observed that sophisticated European society was beginning to embrace tomato cuisine despite continued medical warnings. His French chef Honoré Julien introduced tomato-based sauces and dishes that impressed Jefferson's dinner guests, though many American visitors remained suspicious of anything so obviously foreign and potentially dangerous. Jefferson's approach to tomato advocacy was characteristically intellectual and systematic. He conducted what amounted to controlled experiments, serving tomato dishes to different groups of guests and carefully observing their reactions. He kept detailed notes about which preparations seemed most acceptable to nervous diners and which cooking methods appeared to reduce people's fears about consumption. The real heroes of tomato acceptance, however, were the waves of immigrants who brought their own food traditions to America and Europe throughout the 19th century and absolutely refused to abandon their traditional tomato-based cuisine just because their new neighbors considered it dangerous. Italian immigrants, in particular, created enclaves where tomatoes were not only accepted but celebrated as essential ingredients in everything from simple pasta sauces to elaborate festival dishes. Giuseppe Delmonico, founder of the famous Delmonico's restaurant in New York, played a crucial role in introducing tomatoes to American high society through the back door of sophisticated dining. Starting in the 1830s, Delmonico's served elaborate Italian and French dishes that featured tomatoes prominently, gambling that sophisticated diners would be willing to try exotic foods if they were presented elegantly enough and surrounded by sufficient social prestige. The restaurant's success with tomato dishes was partly due to Delmonico's genius for understanding the psychology of food fears. Instead of serving simple sliced tomatoes that would immediately trigger medical concerns, he incorporated tomatoes into complex sauces and preparations, where their identity was partially disguised by other flavors and sophisticated cooking techniques. Diners could consume tomatoes without feeling like they were directly challenging medical authority. Delmonico's also benefited from the social dynamics of fashionable dining. Customers who had paid premium prices for an exclusive dining experience were psychologically invested in enjoying whatever was served, even if it included ingredients they might normally avoid. The restaurant's reputation for sophistication provided social cover for people who wanted to experiment with forbidden foods without appearing reckless or ignorant. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe also brought tomato-friendly food traditions that conflicted with American and British medical fears. Traditional Jewish cooking included tomato-based dishes that had been safely consumed for generations, and Jewish families saw no reason to abandon these foods based on Christian medical authorities, who often displayed other forms of prejudice against Jewish customs and traditions. Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, one of the founders of Reform Judaism in America, wrote extensively about the importance of maintaining traditional Jewish foodways despite pressure to conform to American dietary practices. In his influential magazine, The Israelite, Rabbi Wise argued that Jewish families should trust their own ancestral wisdom about food safety, rather than accepting medical theories that contradicted centuries of safe consumption. The agricultural community provided another powerful source of tomato advocacy, driven more by economic opportunity than cultural rebellion. Farmers quickly recognized that tomatoes were hardy, productive crops that could generate substantial profits if there was a market for them. Commercial tomato cultivation began in New Jersey and Pennsylvania in the 1820s and 1830s, supported by farmers who were willing to grow anything that customers would buy, regardless of medical or social concerns. The development of commercial tomato processing created new economic pressures that gradually overcame cultural fears through sheer market forces. The first commercial tomato cannery opened in New Jersey in 1847, and canned tomatoes quickly became popular with working-class families who appreciated their convenience and affordability. The canning process seemed to make tomatoes safer in the minds of many consumers. If dangerous fruits could be safely preserved and sold commercially, perhaps they weren't as dangerous as previously believed. Harrison Woodhull Crosby, who opened one of the first major tomato canneries in southern New Jersey, became a powerful advocate for tomato consumption through his business activities. Crosby's cannery employed hundreds of workers who handled tomatoes daily without any apparent ill effects, providing visible evidence that contradicted medical warnings about toxicity. Women played a particularly important role in tomato acceptance, though their contributions were often overlooked by male-dominated medical and scientific authorities. Female cooks and housekeepers in wealthy households often knew perfectly well that tomatoes were safe. They had been eating them in servants' quarters for years, but social conventions prevented them from contradicting their employers' fears directly. Amelia Simmons, author of American Cookery 1796, the first cookbook written by an American, included multiple tomato recipes, despite the prevailing medical warnings. Her book was aimed at practical housewives rather than wealthy society ladies, and she clearly expected her readers to use tomatoes regularly in their cooking. Simmons represented a tradition of practical female knowledge that often contradicted official male authority. Mary Randolph, whose 1824 cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, was enormously influential among Southern families, included detailed instructions for growing, preserving, and cooking tomatoes. Randolph's recipes were sophisticated and elaborate, suggesting that she expected her readers to use tomatoes as standard ingredients rather than exotic curiosities. Her work helped establish tomato consumption as normal practice among practical Southern cooks. The magazine industry also contributed to gradual tomato acceptance through publications aimed at farmers and practical homemakers rather than fashionable society. The American Farmer magazine began running positive articles about tomato cultivation in the 1820s, focusing on their agricultural benefits and nutritional value rather than addressing medical fears directly. These agricultural publications provided practical information about tomato varieties, growing techniques, and preservation methods that helped readers overcome their fears through direct experience. The magazines included testimonials from farmers who had grown tomatoes successfully and families who had consumed them safely, creating a body of contradictory evidence that gradually undermined medical authority. Scientific authorities slowly began to change their positions as well, though they were often reluctant to contradict decades of established medical opinion without overwhelming evidence. Dr. John Cook Bennett of Willoughby University in Ohio published one of the first positive medical assessments of tomatoes in 1834, arguing that they were not only safe but actually beneficial for digestive health and overall nutrition. Bennett's work was initially controversial among his medical colleagues, but it provided crucial scientific cover for people who wanted to try tomatoes without seeming to ignore medical authority entirely. Bennett had impeccable credentials and used the same scientific language and methodology that previous authorities had used to condemn tomatoes, making it difficult for critics to dismiss his conclusions without appearing unscientific themselves. The Civil War created unexpected opportunities for tomato acceptance, as military suppliers discovered that canned tomatoes were practical nutritious foods for feeding large numbers of soldiers under difficult conditions. Union Army purchasing agents bought massive quantities of canned tomatoes for field rations, and soldiers who had never eaten tomatoes before discovered they were both filling and tasty. Military necessity overrode medical concerns in ways that civilian life couldn't. When soldiers were facing bullets and disease, worrying about tomato toxicity seemed petty and irrelevant. The war created a cultural moment when practical considerations trumped social conventions, and tomatoes benefited enormously from this shift in priorities. When these soldiers returned home after the war, they brought their newly acquired tomato tolerance with them to communities that might otherwise have maintained their traditional fears for decades longer. The veterans' experiences provided powerful testimony that contradicted medical warnings and helped normalize tomato consumption among people who respected military authority more than medical theory. Perhaps most importantly, the gradual replacement of pewter dinnerware with ceramic and glass dishes meant that wealthy families were no longer being poisoned when they ate tomatoes, though no one understood the real reason for the change. As the mysterious deaths from tomato consumption became less common, the medical case against tomatoes began to weaken, creating opportunities for advocates to challenge the established orthodoxy. By the 1860s and 1870s, tomato consumption was becoming increasingly acceptable in urban areas and immigrant communities, though social stigma persisted in many conservative circles. The fruit was transitioning from forbidden danger to exotic delicacy to everyday vegetable, but the transformation was gradual and uneven across different regions and social classes. Urban areas and immigrant communities led the way toward tomato acceptance because they had the economic incentives and cultural diversity necessary to challenge established authority. Rural and conservative regions maintained their suspicions well into the late 19th century, creating a patchwork of acceptance and resistance that reflected broader cultural tensions about tradition, innovation, and social change. The brave individuals who challenged tomato fears deserve recognition, not just for their personal courage, but for their willingness to trust direct experience over established authority. In an era when contradicting medical opinion could mark someone as ignorant or reckless, tomato advocates risked social embarrassment and potential health consequences to prove that popular fears were unfounded. Their success helped establish a precedent for questioning authority and testing claims through direct observation, principles that would become crucial for the development of modern scientific thinking. The tomato rebels demonstrated that even the most respected experts could be wrong, and that ordinary people had the right and responsibility to evaluate claims based on evidence rather than authority. The transformation of tomatoes from feared poison to beloved food wasn't the result of any single breakthrough or dramatic revelation. Instead, it was a gradual process of cultural change driven by economic pressures, immigration, urbanization, and the slow accumulation of contradictory evidence that eventually overwhelmed centuries of established fear. This transformation reveals fascinating insights about how societies change their minds about fundamental beliefs and how long-established authorities can be gradually undermined by practical experience and economic necessity. One of the most important factors in tomato acceptance was the simple passage of time and generational change. People who had grown up hearing horror stories about tomato poisoning from their grandparents were naturally more resistant to trying them than young people who had only heard vague warnings from their elders, mixed with contradictory evidence from their own observations. Each generation was slightly more willing to experiment with foods that their parents had considered dangerous, especially as the dire predictions repeatedly failed to materialize in their own experience. The generational shift was particularly pronounced in urban areas where young people had more exposure to immigrant communities that consumed tomatoes regularly without apparent harm. City-dwelling young adults could observe Italian and Jewish families eating tomato-based meals daily, while remaining obviously healthy and prosperous, creating cognitive dissonance with the medical warnings they had been taught to believe. The development of commercial food processing played a crucial role in legitimizing tomatoes for mainstream consumption by creating institutional endorsement for what had previously been considered dangerous behavior. When Campbell's Soup Company introduced its first tomato soup in 1897, it marked the transformation of tomatoes from exotic danger to mainstream American food. The fact that a respectable company was willing to mass-produce and nationally distribute tomato-based products provided powerful evidence that the fears were unfounded. Canned tomatoes had already been gaining acceptance since mid-century, but Campbell's Soup represented something fundamentally different. A processed food that was explicitly marketed to middle-class families as wholesome, safe, and nutritious. The company's advertising emphasized the soup's health benefits and convenience, never acknowledging that tomatoes had ever been considered dangerous. This marketing approach helped normalize tomato consumption by treating it as obviously acceptable rather than exotic or controversial. Dr. John T. Dorrance, the chemist who developed Campbell's tomato soup, later wrote about the challenges of creating a product that would overcome lingering fears about tomato consumption. Dorrance's formula included enough other ingredients to mask the distinctive tomato flavor that might trigger unconscious fears, while still providing the nutritional benefits that made tomatoes valuable. The soup's success demonstrated that consumers were ready to accept tomatoes if they were presented in familiar, non-threatening formats. The growing influence of scientific nutrition also helped undermine traditional tomato fears by providing new frameworks for understanding food safety and health. As physicians and researchers began developing more sophisticated understanding of vitamins, minerals, and balanced nutrition, they recognized that tomatoes were actually among the most nutritious commonly available foods. The discovery that tomatoes were rich in vitamin C made them valuable for preventing scurvy, while their mineral content and low-calorie density made them ideal for healthy diets. Dr. Wilbur Atwater, one of the pioneers of American nutritional science, published influential studies in the 1890s showing that tomatoes were not only safe, but highly beneficial for human health. Atwater's work was particularly important because it came from the emerging field of scientific nutrition rather than traditional medical practice, giving it credibility with people who remained skeptical of older medical authorities. Atwater's nutritional analysis of tomatoes revealed that they contained higher levels of essential nutrients than many foods that had never been considered dangerous. His work helped establish the principle that food safety should be evaluated based on chemical composition and nutritional value, rather than traditional medical theory or social prejudice. The women's suffrage movement contributed to tomato acceptance in unexpected ways that reflected broader changes in gender roles and social authority. As women became more politically active and socially independent, they began challenging traditional authorities in all areas of life, including food and nutrition. Many suffrage leaders explicitly rejected the notion that women were too delicate to consume foods that men could safely eat, and they embraced tomato consumption as a symbol of female strength and independence. Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and a prominent suffrage leader, wrote extensively about the importance of women making their own decisions about food and health rather than blindly following male medical authorities who often knew less about practical nutrition than experienced housewives. While Willard didn't write specifically about tomatoes, her general philosophy encouraged women to trust their own experiences and observations rather than accepting established authority without question. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, one of the first female physicians in America, published influential articles challenging the medical establishment's claims about female vulnerability to various foods and environmental factors. Jacoby argued that many supposed gender differences in food tolerance were actually the result of social conditioning rather than biological reality, and she encouraged women to experiment with foods that had been deemed inappropriate for female consumption. Urban growth and restaurant culture also accelerated tomato acceptance by creating new social contexts where people could try unfamiliar foods without challenging their own family traditions or social identities. As more Americans moved to cities and began eating meals prepared by professional cooks, they encountered tomato-based dishes in contexts that seemed safe, sophisticated, and socially acceptable. Restaurants had strong economic incentives to serve foods that customers enjoyed, regardless of traditional medical fears, and successful establishments that served tomato dishes helped prove their safety through daily demonstration. The restaurant industry also created a buffer between consumers and responsibility for food choices. Diners could experiment with tomatoes by ordering them in restaurants without taking personal responsibility for challenging medical authority. The emergence of Italian-American cuisine as a distinct and popular food tradition provided a particularly important pathway for tomato acceptance. Among working-class families who couldn't afford expensive restaurants but wanted something more exciting than traditional Anglo-American fare, Italian-American dishes like pasta with tomato sauce and pizza became accessible ways for ordinary families to incorporate tomatoes into their diets without feeling like they were making dramatic departures from social norms. Pizza, which began appearing in American cities in the 1880s and 1890s, became a crucial vector for tomato acceptance among young people and urban workers who were less influenced by traditional medical authorities. Pizza parlors served tomato-topped flatbreads to customers who might never have considered eating raw tomatoes, but who were willing to try this exotic fast food that was becoming popular in their neighborhoods. The popularity of pizza helped establish tomatoes as normal ingredients in everyday American food, particularly among Younger consumers who associated tomato consumption with modernity and urban sophistication rather than danger and foreign corruption. Pizza parlors also demonstrated that tomatoes could be safely consumed by people from all social classes and ethnic backgrounds, contradicting theories about class-based differences in tomato tolerance. The decline of formal Victorian culture after the turn of the 20th century also reduced social pressure to avoid tomatoes, as elaborate etiquette rules and social conventions began to seem old-fashioned and unnecessarily restrictive. Younger generations were more willing to make food choices based on personal preference rather than social expectations, and they found the elaborate rituals of tomato avoidance ridiculous rather than sophisticated. The progressive era emphasis on scientific rationality and evidence-based decision-making created cultural momentum for challenging traditional authorities, including medical opinions that couldn't be supported by contemporary scientific methods. Progressive reformers argued that social progress required questioning inherited beliefs and testing claims through systematic observation, which naturally led to skepticism about long-standing food fears. World War I created new practical pressures that accelerated the final acceptance of tomatoes by forcing people to prioritize nutrition and food security over traditional social conventions. The federal government encouraged Americans to grow victory gardens to support the war effort, and tomatoes were among the most practical vegetables for home cultivation due to their productivity and nutritional value. Government propaganda that urged citizens to eat more tomatoes for victory carried more authority than decades of medical warnings, especially when it came from patriotic duty rather than exotic foreign influence. The war created a cultural moment when practical considerations trumped social conventions, and tomatoes benefited enormously from this shift in national priorities. The war also disrupted traditional social hierarchies and cultural assumptions in ways that made old-fashioned fears seem irrelevant and petty. When American soldiers were dying in European trenches, worrying about the social implications of eating tomatoes seemed frivolous and unpatriotic. The war created opportunities for rapid social change that might have taken decades under normal circumstances. By the 1920s, tomato consumption had become completely normalized in American society, and the transformation was so thorough that most people forgot tomatoes had ever been controversial. Cookbooks routinely included tomato recipes without any acknowledgement that they had ever been dangerous. Home economics classes taught students how to grow and prepare tomatoes as standard parts of healthy diets. And most tellingly, the medical establishment began promoting tomatoes as beneficial foods without ever acknowledging their previous opposition or explaining what had changed. The complete rehabilitation of tomatoes was so successful that it erased its own history. By mid-century, the idea that educated people had once feared tomatoes seemed as absurd as believing in witchcraft or thinking the earth was flat. The tomato had completed its journey from deadly poison to wholesome American food, and the cultural memory of the fears had been almost entirely forgotten. This erasure of historical memory is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the tomato story. Within a few generations, fears that had shaped medical practice, social behavior, and cultural identity for centuries simply disappeared from popular consciousness. The speed and completeness of this transformation suggests how quickly societies can abandon beliefs that once seemed absolutely certain, especially when those beliefs conflict with practical experience and economic interests. The tomato's transformation also demonstrates the power of economic forces to overcome even deeply embedded cultural fears. Once tomato cultivation and processing became profitable industries that employed thousands of people and generated significant wealth, the economic interests supporting tomato acceptance became powerful enough to challenge and eventually overwhelm the cultural and medical authorities that had maintained the fears. The story of tomato acceptance provides a fascinating case study in how societies change their fundamental beliefs about safety, health, and appropriate behavior. It shows that even the most scientific-seeming authorities can be wrong for centuries, that practical experience can eventually overcome theoretical knowledge, and that economic and social forces can be more powerful than medical authority in determining what people actually do. Most importantly, the tomato story reveals how missing just one crucial piece of scientific knowledge, in this case, the understanding of how acid foods interact with lead-containing metals, can create elaborate systems of misinformation that persist for generations even when they contradict daily experience and common sense. The tomato's journey from poison to produce reveals something profound and troubling about human nature, scientific authority, and the persistence of cultural beliefs that should make us deeply uncomfortable about our own certainties. For over 3 centuries, educated people convinced themselves that one of the world's most nutritious foods was deadly, and they maintained this conviction despite overwhelming contradictory evidence from their own experiences and observations. This wasn't a case of ignorant people believing superstitions. It was a case of intelligent, well-educated individuals reaching logical conclusions based on the best available information and scientific understanding of their time. The medical authorities who warned against tomatoes weren't charlatans or fools. They were respected physicians making rational decisions based on real evidence that seemed to support their conclusions. The wealthy families who went to elaborate lengths to avoid tomato contamination weren't being hysterical. They were responding reasonably to genuine medical warnings backed by documented cases of poisoning. The tragedy is that they were missing one crucial piece of information: the role of lead-contaminated pewter dinnerware in creating the very deaths they were trying to prevent. Without understanding the chemistry of lead leaching, they had no way to recognize that the problem wasn't the tomatoes themselves, but the plates they were served on. This single gap in scientific knowledge created a perfect storm of misinformation that persisted for generations and caused immeasurable suffering. The tomato panic offers sobering lessons about the power of authoritative misinformation and the difficulty of challenging established beliefs, even when they're demonstrably wrong. Once prominent physicians and scientists had declared tomatoes dangerous, their conclusions became embedded in medical education, popular culture, and social expectations. Contradicting this authority required not just courage but social capital that most people didn't possess. The social dynamics of tomato fears are particularly revealing about how elite opinion can create and maintain harmful beliefs. The wealthy families who were most committed to avoiding tomatoes were the most likely to be poisoned by them, while the poor families who seemed to be recklessly consuming dangerous foods were actually eating safely. But instead of questioning whether their understanding was correct, wealthy people concluded that their superior breeding made them more vulnerable to dangers that hardy peasants could tolerate. This pattern of elite families creating problems for themselves through their own status symbols while blaming the victims of their misunderstanding has troubling parallels in contemporary society. How many modern health scares, food panics, and safety concerns might be based on similar misunderstandings of cause and effect? How many times do we assume that expensive solutions are necessarily better, or that people with more education and resources must know what they're doing? The class dynamics of tomato poisoning also reveal how social hierarchies can literally kill people by preventing them from recognizing obvious solutions to their problems. The servants who ate tomatoes safely from wooden bowls knew perfectly well that the fruits weren't dangerous, but social conventions prevented them from contradicting their employers' fears. The wealthy families had the information they needed to solve their problem right in their own kitchens, but they couldn't access it because they refused to take seriously the knowledge of people they considered their social inferiors. The tomato story also demonstrates how economic interests and practical pressures can eventually overcome even deeply embedded cultural fears, but only after enormous amounts of unnecessary suffering and waste. Farmers who could profit from growing tomatoes, immigrants who wanted to maintain their traditional cuisines, and restaurants that needed to serve appealing food, all had incentives to challenge tomato fears regardless of social pressure. Their willingness to prioritize practical benefits over cultural conformity created the economic foundation for changing attitudes. This suggests that challenging harmful cultural beliefs requires not just courage and evidence, but also economic alternatives that give people practical reasons to abandon old patterns. Social change happens faster when people have material incentives to adopt new behaviors, not just moral or intellectual arguments for why they should change. Perhaps most importantly, the tomato panic shows how quickly societies can completely forget beliefs that once seemed absolutely central to their identity and survival. Within living memory, avoiding tomatoes had been considered essential for health and respectability. By the 1920s, the idea seemed so absurd that few people could even remember why their grandparents had been afraid. This cultural amnesia suggests both the flexibility and the fragility of human beliefs. Societies can abandon deeply held convictions with remarkable speed when circumstances change, but they often lose the memory of why those beliefs seemed important in the first place. This makes it difficult to learn from historical mistakes or to recognize when similar patterns might be emerging in different contexts. The complete transformation of tomato attitudes within a few generations offers both hope and caution for contemporary challenges. It demonstrates that even seemingly intractable cultural problems can be solved through patience, persistence, and the gradual accumulation of contradictory evidence. But it also warns about the power of authoritative misinformation and the difficulty of recognizing when expert consensus might be fundamentally mistaken. Today, when we face new questions about food safety, environmental risks, and health concerns, the tomato story reminds us to maintain healthy skepticism about claims that seem to contradict direct experience and common sense. It encourages us to look for practical explanations rather than accepting dramatic theories, to pay attention to who benefits from maintaining fears and who suffers from them, and to remember that even the most respected authorities can be spectacularly wrong when they're missing crucial information. The Victorian fear of tomatoes wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a perfect example of how smart people can create elaborate systems of misinformation when they're working with incomplete data and unchallenged assumptions. Understanding this story helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time and reminds us that questioning authority, trusting direct experience, and maintaining intellectual humility are essential skills for navigating a complex world where the experts don't always have the answers they claim to possess. The tomato story also reveals the enormous human cost of scientific ignorance and social conformity. For centuries, people suffered and died unnecessarily because they lacked one crucial piece of information about the chemistry of metal cookware. Families lived in constant fear of a common food that could have provided nutrition and pleasure. Social hierarchies were reinforced through elaborate rituals based on completely false beliefs. Economic opportunities were lost, cultural traditions were abandoned, and human knowledge was distorted by a single missing insight. This suggests that our current scientific understanding, no matter how sophisticated it seems, is almost certainly incomplete in ways we can't imagine. The experts of every era have been confident that they understood the fundamental principles governing health, safety, and human behavior, and they have been consistently wrong about crucial details that seemed obvious to later generations. The tomato panic teaches us to hold our certainties lightly, to remain open to contradictory evidence, and to remember that the most dangerous mistakes often come not from ignorance, but from incomplete knowledge combined with excessive confidence. It reminds us that questioning established authority isn't just a right but a responsibility, and that sometimes the most important truths can be found in the experiences of people who aren't considered experts. Most of all, the tomato story shows us that even the most absurd-seeming beliefs can seem perfectly rational to intelligent people who are working with the wrong assumptions. It encourages humility about our own beliefs and skepticism about claims that seem too convenient or that benefit the people making them. And it reminds us that the difference between wisdom and foolishness often depends not on intelligence or education, but on having access to the right information at the right time. The tomato's journey from deadly poison to beloved staple food shows that even the most certain scientific consensus can be completely overturned when new information becomes available. It's a story about the power of persistence, the importance of practical testing over theoretical authority, and the remarkable human capacity to change our minds when the evidence becomes overwhelming enough to overcome our cultural prejudices and social fears. And perhaps most remarkably, it's a story about how a simple misunderstanding about dinnerware created one of history's most persistent and widespread food panics, proving that sometimes the most obvious explanations are the ones that take centuries to discover. In the end, the Victorian fear of tomatoes teaches us that the greatest dangers often come not from the threats we can see, but from the solutions we can't imagine.